The wind howled through the mountain pass, swirling snowflakes that turned the road into a white blur. Caleb Henshaw's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his truck shuddering against the gusts. The snowstorm had caught him off guard. Visibility was down to mere feet, and every mile felt like an eternity. He adjusted his cap, lowering it further to shield his eyes from the biting cold. He didn't mind the discomfort. This was part of the plan, or at least that's what he told himself. He'd been driving for hours, and though his mind was distracted by the roar of the engine, there was something heavier pressing down on him. It wasn't just the storm. His thoughts wandered back to the decision he had made a few days ago, leaving everything behind. The life he had known, the name, the wealth. All of it seemed meaningless now, like an old dream fading in the rearview mirror. He had never felt so alone. As he navigated a particularly treacherous curve, his headlights caught the reflection of something. A car stranded off to the side, smoke rising from the engine. Caleb's heart skipped. Without hesitation, he slammed his foot on the brake and steered the truck toward the shoulder. The truck groaned as it came to a halt, the tires grinding against the icy ground. Caleb quickly pulled his gloves on and climbed out, the cold air biting into his skin. He could barely see through the snow, but he made his way toward the car, his boots crunching against the frozen earth. When he reached the vehicle, he found a young family inside, huddled together for warmth. The father, a man in his 40s with a scruffy beard, rolled down the window. "Hey, can you help us?" he asked, voice strained with worry. "I'll try to get you out of here," Caleb said, offering a calm, reassuring tone despite the anxiety gnawing at him. The family seemed relieved but wary. Caleb could understand the suspicion. Why would a stranger stop in such dangerous conditions? But he wasn't here for small talk. He pulled open the back of the truck, rummaging for a tow rope. As he worked, he could feel the eyes of the family on him. They were probably wondering why someone with no clear reason to be here was risking his life to help. The truth was, Caleb wasn't sure himself. He had been on the road for days, with no destination in mind other than to escape. Finally, with the rope secured and a few quick tugs, the car was freed. The father thanked him repeatedly, but Caleb didn't respond. He just nodded, feeling the weight of the moment but unable to explain why it felt so important. The family got back into their car, rolling up the window. The father mouthed, "Thank you," before starting the engine. Caleb watched them drive off, disappearing into the wall of snow. He was alone again. With a deep breath, Caleb returned to his truck. As he climbed back inside, a familiar ache stirred in his chest. The family had reminded him of everything he had lost, his own wife and child. He clenched his jaw, forcing the memories back into the recesses of his mind. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the snowstorm now a blur of white. For a brief moment, he wondered if he would ever find a way to feel whole again. But in the pit of his stomach, a small, quiet voice whispered that perhaps helping these strangers, even if they would never know his name, was a way to begin the healing. As the truck rumbled on, the weight of the past seemed a little lighter, and the road ahead a little less lonely. The warmth of the cafe hit Caleb like a wave as he stepped through the door. He paused, momentarily overwhelmed by the contrast between the biting cold outside and the cozy atmosphere within. The soft hum of a few murmured conversations and the clink of coffee mugs on saucers filled the air. It was a far cry from the isolation of the road. Behind the counter, a woman in her early 30s with soft brown hair tied back in a messy bun smiled warmly as she spotted him. Her eyes, tired but kind, met his for a brief second. Caleb didn't know why, but something about her felt familiar. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, with a quiet strength that reminded him of someone he once knew. "Can I get you something warm?" she asked, her voice light yet tinged with exhaustion. "Hot coffee, maybe?" "Yeah, I'll take that," Caleb replied, his voice gruff, his eyes scanning the small, modest cafe. The woman busied herself at the counter preparing the drink, and Caleb took a seat at a corner table, his eyes still following her every move. There was something about her, something that felt different from the usual small-town encounter. Hannah, as her apron read, glanced over her shoulder and caught him staring. She smiled shyly, wiping her hands on her apron before bringing his coffee to the table. "Here you go," she said, setting the cup in front of him, the steam curling up in the cold air. "Thanks," Caleb muttered, wrapping his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth that seeped through his fingers. There was a pause, an unspoken understanding hanging in the air between them. Hannah moved to the register and fiddled with the cash drawer, but Caleb could feel the weight of her silence. The cafe felt alive in its own way, but the sadness that lingered just beneath the surface was palpable. "How's business?" Caleb asked, his voice low, more to fill the uncomfortable silence than out of genuine curiosity. Hannah sighed, not looking up from the counter. "Could be better," she said quietly, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "This place is all I've got left, but..." She paused, a small, tired smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It keeps the lights on, I guess." The unspoken pain in her words struck Caleb harder than he expected. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware of his own emotions stirring. "I don't mean to pry, but you've been doing this alone?" Caleb asked, his tone shifting to something softer, more genuine. Hannah hesitated before answering, her hands still occupied with the coffee cups. "Yeah," she said. "It's just me and my daughter now. Her dad, he passed away last year." Her voice wavered, and she quickly turned away as if to hide the tears that threatened to surface. Caleb's heart tightened. He'd never been one to get close to people, and yet, something about Hannah's quiet strength pulled him in. She had endured her own suffering, just as he had. Before he could respond, the door to the cafe opened, and a small, energetic girl ran in, her cheeks rosy from the cold. She bolted behind the counter, her eyes lighting up as she saw her mother. "Mom, I made a snowman outside," the girl exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. "He's huge, and I gave him a carrot nose." Hannah's smile returned, a flicker of joy in her eyes. "That's wonderful, sweetie," she said, bending down to hug her daughter tightly. Caleb watched the scene unfold, his heart aching at the sight of their bond. It was clear that despite everything, Hannah was doing her best to create some semblance of normalcy for her little girl. As he took another sip of his coffee, Caleb couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection with this woman, despite the fact that they were strangers. He had been running from his past, trying to escape the life he had left behind, but in that moment, he realized he wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. He was about to speak when the bell over the door rang again. Caleb glanced up, but it wasn't a customer. It was a man in a suit, holding a letter in his hand. He walked up to Hannah, and Caleb saw her shoulders tense, her posture stiffening as she met his gaze. "Miss Riley," the man said, his voice cold. "I'm afraid we have some bad news. The bank's final notice is here. Your cafe is being repossessed." Hannah's face drained of color, and Caleb could see the weight of those words hit her like a physical blow. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The man handed her the letter, and she took it with trembling hands. The room fell silent as she stood frozen, staring at the paper in disbelief. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He could see it, the helplessness in her eyes. It was like he was looking at a mirror, seeing his own past reflected in her face. The weight of loss, the unbearable feeling of having everything you've worked for slipping through your fingers. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Caleb's grip on his coffee tightened as the silence in the cafe thickened, broken only by the sound of a child's soft giggle in the background. But Caleb knew that the storm outside wasn't the only one brewing. The true storm was here in this cafe in this moment. Caleb's truck rumbled over the icy roads, the engine's growl drowned by the howling wind. The snow had intensified, swirling in a relentless, blinding wall of white. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead, but the visibility was nearly zero. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as he fought to keep the truck steady. The storm wasn't letting up. The mountain pass was dangerous enough without the snow, but in these conditions, he felt like he was driving blind. Every mile felt like an eternity. His mind kept drifting back to Hannah and the devastating news she had received earlier. The cafe, her livelihood, was about to be taken from her. He had wanted to say something, to offer more than just a cup of coffee, but he hadn't found the right words. Instead, he'd left the cafe in silence, weighed down by the feeling that he couldn't fix anything. He couldn't even fix his own life, let alone hers. Suddenly, his headlights flickered across something, a shadow in the distance. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. A car stopped on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing weakly against the snowstorm. Without a second thought, he slammed his foot on the brake, the truck sliding slightly on the icy ground. His tires screeched in protest, but Caleb managed to steer the truck to the shoulder and came to a halt beside the stranded vehicle. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gloves, threw open the door, and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind bit at his exposed skin, but he pushed forward, heading toward the car. The driver, a middle-aged woman, was visibly shaken, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she looked up at him with wide eyes. Her face was pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Are you all right?" Caleb called out over the wind, his voice steady, though inside, his heart was racing. The woman nodded, but it was clear she was scared. The car had stalled in the middle of nowhere, and with the storm worsening, her chances of being rescued were slim. Caleb could see the fear in her eyes, and it made his chest tighten. He wasn't a hero. He didn't want to be a hero, but something in him couldn't leave her stranded in the snow. "Let me help you," he said firmly. "We need to get you out of here before it gets worse." The woman nodded again, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I'm scared." Caleb forced a reassuring smile. "I'll get you out of here. You're not alone." He quickly assessed the situation. The snow was deep, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. The car's engine was cold, and Caleb wasn't sure how much longer it would last. He reached into the back of his truck for his tow rope, tying it securely to the front bumper of the car. As he worked, his mind wandered again, back to the cafe, to Hannah and Lila. He wondered if they were still awake, whether the storm had reached them yet. Would they be okay? Or was her world about to fall apart? He jerked the rope tight, then climbed back into his truck. With a deep breath, Caleb shifted the truck into gear and gently eased it forward, the rope taut between the two vehicles. He could feel the resistance as the truck strained against the snow, but slowly, inch by inch, the car began to budge. A few more minutes passed, and with one last pull, the car was free. Caleb quickly parked his truck, rushing back to the woman's side to make sure she was all right. Her eyes were wide with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Caleb smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's nothing. Just be careful. You shouldn't be out here in this storm." The woman nodded, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. "I'll make sure to head home. But you saved me." Caleb hesitated, watching her drive off into the snowstorm. He was used to being invisible, to keeping to the shadows, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. As he watched the car disappear into the blizzard, Caleb's chest tightened. His thoughts flickered to Hannah once again, and he wondered if there was more he could do. More than just a passing moment of help. He couldn't fix the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could help her find a way forward. With a deep sigh, Caleb climbed back into his truck. The storm raged on outside, but for the first time in days, he felt a spark of something. Hope, maybe. Or maybe just the sense that, no matter how small the act, he could still make a difference. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the snowstorm still raging ahead. But Caleb wasn't running from his past anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to find a way to move forward. The night was thick with cold when Caleb pulled into the small parking lot behind Hannah's cafe. The snowstorm had begun to let up, but the damage was already done. The streets were silent, and the once bustling town now felt like a place frozen in time. His truck's headlights illuminated the storefront, and what he saw made his heart drop into his stomach. Hannah's cafe was burning. The flames flickered violently against the night sky, dancing in orange and red hues that painted the surrounding snow with an eerie glow. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he quickly parked the truck and rushed toward the building. Smoke billowed from the broken windows, curling into the air like some monstrous entity. The sound of crackling wood and the fire's roar echoed in his ears. His mind raced. How had this happened? Was anyone inside? He didn't hesitate. Caleb sprinted toward the door, his boots crunching against the icy ground, the cold air biting at his skin. The scent of smoke stung his nose as he reached the entrance, but the door was locked. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. He kicked the door, desperation growing in his chest. Just then the door opened. Standing there, silhouetted against the flames, was Hannah. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair wild, her eyes wide with panic. "Get out, it's not safe," she yelled over the roar of the fire, her voice cracking. Caleb's chest tightened. "I'm not leaving without you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. He could see the terror in her eyes, but there was no time for words. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the door and toward the alley, away from the smoke and flames. But as they moved, something in her expression faltered. She stopped, eyes locked on the cafe. "My cafe," she whispered, her voice hollow with loss. "Everything I've worked for." Her words trailed off as the reality of what was happening sank in. Caleb's grip on her arm tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't know how to comfort her. What could he say to someone who had just lost everything? Instead, he led her down the alley, away from the fire's consuming reach. When they reached a safe distance, Caleb turned her toward him. She was trembling, her face pale from the cold and the shock. The tears she hadn't shed before began to fall, streaking down her soot-covered cheeks. "I'm so sorry," Caleb murmured. He didn't know if the words were meant for her, for the cafe, or for himself. Perhaps they were meant for all of it. Hannah sank to her knees in the snow, her sobs echoing in the silent night. Caleb knelt beside her, unsure what to do next. He was a man who had spent his life running from his own pain. But watching her break down in front of him, he realized how much he had been avoiding facing the suffering of others. A few minutes passed, maybe longer, before Hannah looked up at him, her tear-streaked face framed by the snow. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Caleb didn't have an answer. He was still trying to make sense of his own life. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll figure this out together." But even as he said it, Caleb knew the path ahead wasn't going to be easy. The fire had stolen everything she had built, and the road to recovery was long and uncertain. Yet for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like he had a reason to stay, to make sure she didn't have to rebuild it alone. He stood up, offering his hand to help her to her feet. She took it, her grip shaking but determined. There was a long road ahead, but they would walk it together. As they turned away from the flames, Caleb's thoughts flickered back to the tragedy that had shaped his own life. He had lost everything too. But as he looked at Hannah standing beside him, he felt something stir within him, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could help someone else heal. He wasn't sure how, but he would find a way, for her, for himself. The first snowflakes of December had begun to fall, covering the world outside in a delicate layer of white. Caleb sat in the small corner of Hannah's makeshift living room, sipping his coffee. The fire in the corner crackled softly, adding a warmth to the otherwise quiet space. It had been 2 days since the fire destroyed the cafe, and Caleb could still feel the weight of it hanging in the air, even as the fire had long since been put out. Hannah had been quiet ever since, grieving not only the loss of her livelihood, but also the dreams that had gone with it. She and Lila had been staying in the back of Caleb's truck, which felt like an awkward and temporary solution. The cafe was all Hannah had, and without it she felt lost. Lila, however, was a different story. Despite the chaos and heartbreak surrounding her, she remained a beacon of hope, a reminder of resilience. Caleb had noticed her playing outside in the snow earlier, her laughter breaking through the somber mood like a flash of light. It was hard not to smile when he heard her voice. He had tried to get closer to both of them, but a wall of silence seemed to be between him and Hannah. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate his help, but her pride, her independence, everything she had worked for, was now slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know how to let anyone else in. Caleb understood. After all, he had been running from his own demons for years, But seeing her struggle, the guilt crept in again. Was he doing enough? A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Caleb?" He turned to see Lila standing in the doorway, holding something small and fragile in her hands. Her wide eyes looked up at him with an innocence that tugged at his heart. "I made something," she said, her voice quiet but filled with the excitement of a child eager to share a secret. She walked over to the table and gently placed a folded piece of paper in front of him. Curious, Caleb unfolded it. It was a letter, written in Lila's careful, uneven handwriting. "Dear Santa, I know you were busy, but I really need your help this year. My mom's cafe burned down and she's really sad. Could you please bring her a new one? I promise I've been good. And if you can, could you bring me a toy truck like the one I saw in the store? Love, Lila." Caleb stared at the letter, his throat tight. The simplicity of Lila's wish, the selflessness of it, was overwhelming. She wasn't asking for toys or candies like most kids would. She was asking for something far more meaningful, a chance to bring joy back into her mother's life. Lila looked up at him, her small face serious, awaiting his response. Caleb cleared his throat, trying to mask the lump forming there. "That's a very special letter, Lila," he said softly. He could feel his heart breaking as he looked at her. This little girl carrying the weight of her mother's dreams on her small shoulders. "I'll make sure Santa sees it," Caleb continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And who knows, maybe he'll work his magic." Lila smiled, her face lighting up with hope. "You really think he'll help?" she asked, her voice filled with belief. "I do," Caleb said, though doubt lingered in his chest. He had never been a man of faith, at least, not in the traditional sense, but in that moment, something about Lila's pure-hearted wish made him believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them to rebuild, not just a cafe, but their lives. Later that evening, as Hannah went to bed, Caleb sat in the quiet of the room, staring at the letter in his hands. He hadn't told Lila that the letter might never reach Santa. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the real magic wasn't in some mythical figure, but in the love and hope that her letter represented. He was no Santa Claus, but maybe he could be part of the miracle. Maybe he could help Hannah rebuild the cafe, give her the chance to feel like she had control over her life again. As Caleb stared at the letter, a plan began to form in his mind, one that would require all the courage and resources he had left. But for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something deeper than just guilt. He felt a need to give, to do something good. The road ahead was uncertain, and the storm of uncertainty still loomed over them. But Caleb knew something had changed inside him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just running away from his own pain. He was staying not just for himself, but for Hannah, for Lila, perhaps even for the possibility of redemption. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, standing up and walking toward the door. There was work to be done, and Caleb knew that he wasn't alone in this anymore. The warmth of the coffee shop did little to shake Caleb's unease. He had tried to make himself comfortable, sitting in the back corner, but the events of the past few days kept him on edge. He kept glancing at the door, waiting for Hannah to appear. She had asked for some space, rightfully so, after everything that had happened with the fire and the destruction of the cafe. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do, something more he could offer. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he couldn't leave Flagstaff yet, not while she and Lila were still struggling. As Caleb took another sip of his coffee, the door opened. A man entered, shaking off the snow from his jacket and scanning the room. Caleb recognized him immediately. Mason Clark, the trucker who had worked alongside him on the icy roads in the past week. Mason's eyes met Caleb's, and there was no mistaking the look in his gaze. It was a mixture of suspicion and something darker, something Caleb couldn't quite place. Caleb had known Mason wasn't exactly fond of him, but this felt different. There was an edge to his presence today, one that didn't sit well with Caleb. Mason approached the table, his steps slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, before finally speaking. "Caleb," Mason said, his voice low, "we need to talk." Caleb nodded, setting his coffee down, his senses sharpening. What's going on, Mason? Mason slid into the chair across from him, his eyes narrowing. I've been thinking about this, he said, his voice thick with tension. You've been here a few days now. You've been helping Hannah, but something doesn't sit right with me. Caleb's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't going to let Mason see that he was rattled. He'd been through too much to let his guard down now. What do you mean? Caleb asked, his voice steady. You know what I mean, Mason snapped, leaning in closer. People around here don't know you. You don't have a business, no family. You just showed up, all quiet, all helpful, and no one asks any questions. You think people don't notice? Caleb's stomach churned. It was exactly the kind of thing he had been trying to avoid, being noticed. His past was something he hadn't been able to outrun, and it seemed Mason wasn't letting him forget it. I'm just trying to help, Caleb said, his voice calmer than he felt. What's your problem with that? Mason's eyes flashed with something Caleb couldn't quite decipher. You're lying to them, Caleb. Lying to everyone. The accusation hit harder than Caleb expected. He had done everything he could to keep his past buried, to stay anonymous. But Mason's words made him feel like all of it was slipping away. He could feel the walls closing in, the fear creeping up his spine. Mason leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. I did some digging, he said, his voice colder now. You've been running away from something, haven't you? You think people here are too stupid to notice, but I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to let you use them to cover up your mess. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. The lie, the mask he had worn for so long, was crumbling before him. Mason knew, or at least suspected, the truth. Mason, you don't know what you're talking about, Caleb said, his voice sharp now, the calm facade slipping. This has nothing to do with anyone here. It's none of your business. Mason's lip curled into a bitter smile. You think they're all going to just forgive you, let you hide in plain sight? You're not the only one with a past, Caleb. The words hit harder than anything Caleb had heard in a long time. For a moment, it wasn't the betrayal that stung. It was the reminder that he couldn't escape himself, that no matter where he went, the past would always catch up with him. You think I'm just going to let you walk away with this lie? Mason continued, his voice rising. You don't belong here, Caleb. You're using these people, and I'm going to make sure they know the truth. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, the weight of Mason's words sinking in. His mind raced. If Mason told the town about his past, about who he really was, it could destroy everything he had tried to build here, everything he had been trying to repair inside himself. I won't let you do that, Caleb said, his voice steady but hard. The resolve was clear in his words. He wouldn't let Mason expose him, not now, not when he had finally started to see a chance at redemption. Mason's eyes bored into him, a cold challenge in his gaze. We'll see about that, won't we? He said, standing up from the table. As Mason turned and walked out of the cafe, Caleb sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. For the first time since he arrived in Flagstaff, he felt more trapped than ever. He had spent so long running from his past, but now it seemed there was no place left to hide. The early morning fog had barely lifted when Caleb felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He was sitting at the back table of Hannah's cafe, waiting for her to return from running errands, when the door opened. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The heavy boots on the wooden floor and the faint jingle of keys told him everything he needed to know. Sheriff Tom Carver was standing in the doorway, his tall frame blocking most of the light coming in from the street. He surveyed the room for a moment, his gaze lingering on Caleb before stepping inside. Morning, Caleb, the sheriff said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Caleb nodded, trying to maintain a neutral expression. Morning, Sheriff. Carver didn't immediately sit. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward the counter and leaned against it, crossing his arms over his chest. The sheriff was a man who didn't rush, who didn't reveal much with his words, but whose eyes always seemed to see more than people realized. I've been meaning to catch up with you, Carver said, his gaze narrowing slightly as he fixed Caleb with a steady look. Caleb's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his cool. What about? The sheriff paused, then gave a small shrug. Nothing too serious. Just a couple of things I've been thinking about. He finally slid into the chair across from Caleb, his eyes still piercing, but the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I've been noticing you around here a lot, Carver continued, his voice dropping just enough to make it clear he wasn't making small talk anymore. Helping Hannah, helping the town. No one's complaining, mind you, but you're not exactly what you seem. Caleb's pulse quickened. He leaned forward, hoping his face didn't betray the nervousness creeping up on him. Not sure what you mean, Sheriff. Carver didn't blink. You don't talk much about your past, Caleb. That's fine, I get it. But people are starting to notice. People like Mason. At the mention of Mason's name, Caleb felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his expression neutral. The thought of Mason spreading rumors made his stomach churn, but he knew better than to show it. What about Mason? Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice level. Carver sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. Mason's been a bit too curious for his own good, but he's right about one thing. You don't belong here. You came from somewhere, Caleb, and sooner or later people will start asking questions. Caleb's eyes darted to the door, but the sheriff was watching him closely. He had no choice now but to stay calm, but every fiber of his being was screaming to get up and leave. It wasn't that he was scared of Carver. Caleb had learned long ago to face down men like him, in the business world, on the streets, anywhere. But this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just his identity on the line. It was the life he had just begun to build, one fragile connection at a time. I'm not hiding from anything, Caleb said, his voice firmer than he felt. I'm here because I want to be. I'm helping out where I can. Carver's eyes softened just slightly. He didn't seem convinced, but he also wasn't pressing Caleb any harder. I'm not accusing you of anything, Caleb, but I'll tell you one thing. You won't be able to keep this up for long. Sooner or later, someone's going to figure you out. Someone's going to want answers. The weight of Carver's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Caleb knew it wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation for him to confess, to explain himself. But there was no explanation. He couldn't just tell the sheriff about the life he'd left behind, about the man he used to be. It was too complicated, too painful. And in a small town like this, the truth would destroy everything. I'm not looking for trouble, Caleb said, his voice quieter now. I just want to help. Carver studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, finally dropping his arms and looking around the cafe. I can see that, but there's only so much that charity can do, Caleb. People in this town, they're good people, but if you're not careful, they'll see you as just another person trying to use them, and that's a reputation no one here will forget. Caleb swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if the sheriff was trying to threaten him or just give him a warning, but either way, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Thanks for the heads up, Caleb said quietly, standing up. But I'm not going anywhere. Carver watched him carefully, nodding slowly. We'll see. Just be careful, Caleb. I'm watching. The sheriff turned to leave, but Caleb's eyes followed him, the weight of the conversation settling deep in his chest. He didn't know if Carver was a threat or just a man doing his job, but one thing was clear. Caleb couldn't keep running, and sooner or later the truth about who he really was would come out. The tension in the air was palpable as Caleb sat alone at the table, watching the door of the cafe open and close as a few regulars trickled in. The warmth of the space felt distant, as if the walls were closing in around him, pressing the weight of recent events on his shoulders. Mason's betrayal had shaken him. There was no denying it now. People were starting to question him. Sheriff Carver's words echoed in his mind. Sooner or later, someone's going to want answers. The sheriff had warned him, but he hadn't expected Mason to be the one to spill the beans. Caleb's grip on the coffee cup tightened, his fingers trembling slightly. He had kept his distance from everyone, lived under the radar, and now, it seemed like the quiet, peaceful town of Flagstaff was slowly beginning to unravel. Here you go, Hannah's voice broke through his thoughts as she set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Her smile was tired, but she wore it nonetheless. a shield against the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. "Thanks," Caleb muttered, glancing up at her. His eyes lingered on her face, noticing the deep lines that had begun to form since the fire. Her eyes were weary, but they held something else, something unspoken. She looked over at the few townsfolk sitting in the corner, whispering among themselves, glancing occasionally in Caleb's direction. He could feel the shift in the room, whispers, stares, people talking behind closed doors, speculating, judging. Hannah followed his gaze and sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's been like this for a few days now," she said quietly, her voice low. "People are talking. Some of them think you're hiding something." Caleb's stomach twisted, but he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't hiding anything except the truth about who he really was, why he came to Flagstaff in the first place. Every lie he told, every moment he tried to blend in, felt like it was unraveling before him. "I didn't ask for any of this," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Hannah, his heart aching. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." Hannah's gaze softened, but there was a hard edge to her expression. "You didn't. But this town, they don't take kindly to people who don't fit in. And they don't like secrets." The words stung, but they were true. Caleb knew it. He'd spent his whole life running, hiding from the mistakes he couldn't outrun. Now, here in this small town, the walls he had carefully built around himself were starting to crumble. As he sat there, the door to the cafe swung open again, and in walked Sheriff Carver, his boots heavy on the floor as he made his way toward the counter. He nodded at Hannah, then glanced at Caleb. The tension in the room thickened as the sheriff stood there for a moment, as though considering his next move. "I need to talk to you," Carver said, his tone neutral but firm. Caleb felt his heart race. He wasn't sure if this was a continuation of the conversation from the other day, or if it was something worse. The sheriff's gaze lingered on Caleb for a long moment before he turned to face the other patrons. "Folks, I'll need a few minutes with Mr. Henshaw. If you could step outside for a moment." The cafe was silent as the townsfolk filed out, leaving Caleb and Carver alone. The air was thick with unspoken words. Caleb's throat tightened as the sheriff pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Carver didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, watching Caleb with those steady, calculating eyes. "You're not fooling anyone," Carver finally said, breaking the silence. His voice wasn't harsh, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "I've been watching you, Caleb, watching you closely." Caleb's heart pounded. He tried to keep his face neutral, but he could feel the weight of Carver's gaze. "I've had people asking questions, too many questions," the sheriff continued. "People around here, they know when something's off, and they're starting to put pieces together." Caleb's mind raced. He had tried to keep his secrets buried, but it was clear that he couldn't keep running. The sheriff knew. Mason knew. The town was beginning to find out, piece by piece. "I'm not hiding anything, Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the nervousness gnawing at him. He wasn't sure if he believed the words himself, but he had to say them. Carver leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Caleb, but you need to know something. The town, it's torn. Some people are on your side, but others, they're not so sure. And right now, you're the one who's under the microscope." Caleb felt his heart sink. He had known this was coming, but hearing it from Carver made it real. He had tried to be a part of this community, but now it seemed like there was no way back. His past, his mistakes, were catching up with him. "We'll see how this plays out," Carver said, standing up. "But I'd suggest you start being a little more honest with people before they make their own conclusions." As the sheriff left, Caleb sat in the silence, his mind spinning. The town was divided, torn between those who trusted him and those who saw him as an outsider. And as the weight of the sheriff's words hung over him, Caleb knew that his time in Flagstaff was running out. How much longer could he keep pretending? The road ahead was slick with ice, the tires of Caleb's truck skimming dangerously close to the edge of the mountain pass. He hadn't planned on driving today, but when Hannah had called in a panic, telling him that she needed supplies from the nearby town, there hadn't been a choice. Her face, worn down by the fire and the chaos it had caused, still lingered in his mind. He couldn't turn his back on her, not now, not after everything. But the snowstorm was relentless. The visibility had dropped to nearly nothing, and the mountain roads twisted like a serpent through the forest. Caleb tightened his grip on the wheel, trying to keep the truck steady as the wind howled against the metal. His mind wasn't on the road. It kept drifting back to the conversation he'd had with Sheriff Carver the day before. The town was growing more suspicious of him, of his sudden arrival, of his willingness to help. The sheriff had warned him. People were starting to notice, and Mason's words still echoed in his ears. "You're not fooling anyone, Caleb." The fear of being discovered, of losing the fragile connection he had started to build with the people in Flagstaff, gnawed at him. But there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. His decisions, his past, had led him to this point. And right now, the only thing that mattered was getting the supplies to Hannah, getting her through this. His truck veered slightly as a gust of wind hit it, sending a fresh wave of snow across the windshield. He swore under his breath, his hands shaking with the strain of trying to keep control. The road was treacherous, but he couldn't stop now. He had to get to Hannah. Suddenly, the truck jolted violently as it hit a patch of ice. Caleb's stomach lurched as the tires spun out of control. His heart hammered in his chest as the truck slid sideways, skidding toward the cliff's edge. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, every second dragging on, and Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The truck veered dangerously close to the edge before finally slamming into a snowbank that halted its movement. Caleb sat frozen for a moment, his hands still clutching the wheel. His heart pounded in his chest and he could feel the cold sweat prickling along his spine. That could have been it. One wrong turn, and he would have gone over the edge. The sheer thought of it made his stomach turn. Taking a deep breath, Caleb slowly released his grip on the wheel and glanced around. The truck was still upright, still on the road, but the snow outside had grown even heavier, swirling in dense sheets. He needed to move, needed to get out of the truck and make sure it was still functional. He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, the biting cold hitting him like a slap to the face. Stepping out into the snow, Caleb surveyed the truck. The front end was buried in the snowbank, but it was still in one piece. He was lucky. But the luck didn't last long. As he began to try and free the truck from the snowbank, a sound in the distance caught his attention. A faint honk, then another. Caleb turned around, his eyes squinting against the blinding white of the snowstorm. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the sound wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from up ahead. A car. Another vehicle was stuck in the snow, just down the road, barely visible through the storm. Caleb's first instinct was to ignore it, to focus on his own situation. But the voice of the woman he had saved earlier, the one from the storm, flashed through his mind. "Thank you. You saved me." His chest tightened. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't leave anyone behind, even if it meant putting himself at risk. Swearing under his breath, Caleb grabbed the tow rope from the back of his truck, his mind racing. If he didn't act fast, this person, whoever it was, could be in serious danger. The wind picked up again as Caleb trudged through the snow, the blizzard worsening with every step. He couldn't see clearly, couldn't make out any details about the car ahead, but he could hear the soft sound of the horn, each blast a desperate call for help. When he finally reached the car, he found a young man shivering inside, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The car had slid off the road and into a snowbank, its tires spinning helplessly. Caleb didn't waste any time. He hooked the tow rope to the back of the car, pulling it taut. The man in the car looked up, eyes wide with relief. "Thank you. I thought I was going to be stuck here forever." "No problem," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the pounding of his heart. "Hold on tight. We'll get you out." It took all of Caleb's strength and patience to pull the car free from the snowbank. But after several minutes of steady work, the vehicle was back on the road. The young man rolled down his window, his face filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice filled with awe. Caleb shook his head. "Just stay safe out here. It's too dangerous to be driving in this storm." With one final glance at the man, Caleb climbed back into his truck, the fear of the storm still looming large in his mind. He hadn't saved the man for praise or for thanks. He had done it because, in that moment, he knew what it meant to be stuck, to be lost, and he wasn't going to leave anyone behind. He turned the truck around and headed back toward the town, the road ahead still treacherous, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't running anymore. The town hall was decorated for Christmas, with lights twinkling like stars in the evening sky, and wreaths hanging from every door. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversations. Caleb stood at the back of the room, his hands in his pockets, watching the townspeople mingle. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. This was it, the Christmas gala that Caleb had worked so hard to organize. It wasn't much, a small gathering, some food, a bit of music. But for Hannah, for the town, it meant something. It was a way to rebuild, to remind everyone that even in the face of loss, there was still hope. Hannah had been hesitant at first. She didn't want to get her hopes up after the fire, after losing everything. But Caleb had insisted, and now, here they were. She had helped put the event together, using what little remained from the cafe to make it feel like something special. Caleb felt the weight of the night on his shoulders. There were too many eyes on him, too many whispers behind his back. The tension in the room was palpable. It was a delicate balance, trying to be the hero while keeping his past hidden. People were beginning to ask questions, and as much as he had tried to stay out of the spotlight, it was getting harder to keep the truth buried. His gaze shifted to Hannah. She was talking to a few of the townsfolk near the punch bowl, her face still carrying the exhaustion from the last few weeks. Yet there was a spark in her eyes now, a glimmer of the woman she used to be. Caleb watched her for a moment, and something inside him stirred. He wasn't sure why, but helping her, helping them, felt like the right thing to do. He had been running for so long, hiding from his past, but tonight, he felt a strange sense of belonging. These people, this town, maybe, just maybe, he could make it work here. But that thought was quickly interrupted when the door to the hall creaked open. Caleb turned, his body stiffening as the sheriff stepped inside. Sheriff Carver's presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. The conversation stuttered to a halt and Caleb's heart skipped a beat. Carver's gaze locked onto Caleb as he made his way through the crowd, his movements slow, deliberate. The sheriff nodded at a few people as he passed, but it was clear he wasn't here for small talk. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected Carver to show up tonight. The tension between them was still too fresh, the conversation from earlier still hanging like a dark cloud. As Carver approached, Caleb took a step forward, his palms suddenly clammy. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice even but with an edge of caution. "I didn't expect to see you here." Carver gave him a small, almost knowing smile. "I figured I should stop by," he said, his voice low enough for only Caleb to hear. "Make sure everything's running smoothly." Caleb nodded stiffly, trying to keep his composure. "I appreciate it," he replied. But there was an undertone to the sheriff's words that sent a chill down his spine. Carver glanced around the room before turning his gaze back to Caleb. "You know, it's funny. You've been a part of this town for what? A few weeks now, and already you've got people talking." The weight of the words settled heavily between them. Caleb's heart began to pound, but he kept his expression neutral. "People talk," he said, trying to play it off. "It's nothing to worry about." Carver's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is it? Because some people think you're hiding something, and it's getting harder to ignore." Caleb's stomach twisted. He had been careful, but he knew it was only a matter of time before Carver made his move. The sheriff wasn't stupid, and Caleb had a sinking feeling that the walls around his secrets were about to come crashing down. Before Caleb could respond, Hannah appeared at his side, her expression warm but wary. "Everything okay?" she asked, looking between Caleb and Carver. Carver nodded at her, his demeanor shifting slightly. "Just making sure everything's in order, Hannah. It's good to see you here," smiling again. Hannah offered a small smile in return, but Caleb could tell she was uncomfortable. The tension between her and the sheriff was palpable. She had never trusted authority figures, and after what happened with the fire, she had every reason not to. Caleb's mind raced, but he forced himself to focus on the present. He couldn't let Carver ruin this night, not when people were starting to find a little joy again, not when the town was beginning to heal. As the sheriff turned to leave, he shot one last glance at Caleb. "Enjoy the night," he said, his voice almost too casual. "But remember, Caleb, people are always watching." Caleb's heart beat a little faster as he watched Carver disappear into the crowd. The threat was clear, even if it was wrapped in a smile. People were starting to question him, and if he didn't act fast, the truth would come out. He glanced at Hannah, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was something in her gaze, something that made him feel like, despite everything, he wasn't completely alone. He wasn't running anymore. He had a chance to rebuild, to right some of the wrongs he had done. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like he had a place to belong. But as the night wore on, he knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The snow had finally stopped, leaving the town cloaked in a blanket of white. Caleb walked down the main street, his boots crunching against the fresh snow. The Christmas gala had been a bittersweet success. People had smiled, laughed, and danced, but underneath the festivities, the tension was still palpable. The town was divided. He could feel the weight of their stares, their whispered questions. As he passed the cafe, what was left of it, a familiar ache tightened in his chest. The fire had destroyed so much, but it hadn't extinguished the memories. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at the charred remains of the place that had meant so much to Hannah. His thoughts drifted back to the night of the fire. The way Hannah had looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude, but also something else. The weight of her loss. The weight that he felt too. It wasn't just the cafe, it was everything. Everything he had left behind. Caleb took a deep breath, trying to shake the memories, but they clung to him like the cold that had settled deep into his bones. He had been running for so long, running from himself, from the man he had become. The truth about who he really was felt like a heavy burden on his chest. He had built a life for himself here, in Flagstaff, but how long could he keep pretending? How long could he hide the truth? His feet moved on their own as he walked toward the outskirts of town, toward the small cemetery on the hill. It was the last place he had wanted to visit, but something inside him urged him forward. The cold air stung his face as he reached the entrance. The graveyard was quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the bare branches of the trees. Caleb stopped in front of a modest headstone, the name engraved on it sending a pang of guilt straight through his heart. It was his family's grave, his wife Claire and their child. They had died in the car crash years ago. He had been there, right there when it happened. But the accident had broken him in ways he couldn't explain. He hadn't been able to save them. He hadn't been able to do anything. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breath coming in shallow gasps, the past pressing down on him. He had run so far from this place, from this pain. But now, standing here in front of their graves, he couldn't escape it anymore. The guilt, the shame, the sense of failure. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't save you." The words hung in the air, unanswered, as they always had been. Caleb's chest tightened, and he sank to his knees in the snow. His hand reached out to touch the cold stone, his fingers trembling. He had buried so much of himself in the past. His regrets, his mistakes, the memories of Claire and their daughter. He had buried them all, hoping that by running away he could leave the pain behind. But now, as he knelt in front of their graves, he realized the truth. Running had never been the answer. It had only kept him trapped in his own guilt. He had been so focused on surviving, on escaping the life he had lost, that he hadn't realized he had been losing himself in the process. The man who stood before the grave now was a stranger to the man he used to be. Tears blurred Caleb's vision as he sat in the snow, his head bowed. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, but eventually he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to find Hannah standing beside him, her face soft with sympathy. She had found him, like she always did when he needed her the most. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said, her voice gentle. Caleb shook his head, trying to wipe the tears from his face. "I've spent my whole life trying to outrun it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But it's never enough. Hannah knelt beside him, her presence a comfort. You don't need to outrun it anymore, you just need to face it. Caleb looked at her, her words sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do this alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to forgive himself, to heal. You've done more for me than anyone ever has, he said quietly. I don't know if I can ever repay you for that. Hannah smiled, her hand gently resting on his arm. You don't have to repay me, Caleb. You just have to live and let yourself be part of something again. Her words were a lifeline, and Caleb felt something inside him shift. He didn't have to carry the weight of the past forever. He could still change. He could still make things right. Together they stood, facing the cold wind that swept across the hill. The past was still there, but for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt a sense of peace. The weight of his guilt had not disappeared, but it no longer felt as suffocating. He wasn't running anymore. The first rays of sunlight peeked through the snow-covered trees, casting a warm glow over the small town of Flagstaff. The air was crisp, carrying with it the promise of a fresh start. Caleb stood at the edge of the town, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. The weight of the past, the guilt that had been suffocating him for so long, seemed to lift just a little. He wasn't sure how he had gotten here, how he had gone from a man running away from his past to someone who, for the first time in years, felt like he could make a difference. The road had been long and full of obstacles, but now as he stood at the crossroads of his future, Caleb realized that maybe he wasn't the person he had been before. Maybe he was finally ready to face what he had been avoiding for so long. Hannah's cafe, though still under reconstruction, stood as a symbol of hope. It wasn't just the building, it was what it represented. The fire, the devastation, and the struggles they had all faced. It was proof that things could be rebuilt, even from the ashes. Caleb had spent days working side by side with Hannah and the townspeople, helping to rebuild what had been lost. He could see the change in her too. She had stopped being so withdrawn, so hesitant. Her strength, the strength that had carried her through so many hardships, was finally coming back. She had a renewed sense of purpose, and so did he. Are you ready for today? Hannah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her standing behind him, a faint smile on her face. Her eyes still carried the weight of her past, but there was something else in them now. Hope, and it was contagious. I'm ready, Caleb replied, his voice steady. He wasn't just talking about the cafe. He was talking about himself. He was ready to face whatever came next, to finally stop running. Good, Hannah said, walking toward him. We've got a lot to do, but we're getting there, one step at a time. Together, they walked toward the cafe. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from something else, a strange sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could help heal the wounds that had plagued this town. As they entered the cafe, Caleb was greeted by the hum of activity. The townspeople were working together, painting walls, arranging furniture, and putting everything back in place. The spirit of community was alive here, stronger than ever. Caleb had been a part of many communities before, but this one felt different. Here, people helped each other not out of obligation, but because they cared. The door opened, and a few more townsfolk entered, carrying tools and materials. The mayor was among them, a big grin on his face as he waved toward Caleb. Looks like we're finally going to get this place up and running again, huh? The mayor said, clapping Caleb on the back. You've done a hell of a job, Caleb. Couldn't have done it without you. Caleb smiled, but the words that had been on the tip of his tongue suddenly caught in his throat. He wanted to tell them everything, to finally share the truth about who he was, why he had come here. But somehow, standing in the middle of all this, surrounded by people who had already accepted him, he realized that it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't the man he used to be. He had been given a chance to be a part of something real. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I'm just glad I could help, Caleb said, his voice hoarse with emotion. He looked around the room, seeing the familiar faces of people who had trusted him, even when they had no reason to. This is what it's all about, right? people coming together. Hannah joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Exactly, she said, and we couldn't have done it without you. The words settled in Caleb's chest, making him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Worth. For so long, he had felt like a failure, running from the mistakes of his past. But now, as he looked at the people in this room, he realized that redemption wasn't a single act. It was a journey. And this was just the beginning. Later that day, as the sun began to set, the town gathered in front of the cafe. Caleb stood beside Hannah, the mayor, and the other townspeople, watching as people came together, smiling, laughing, and talking as if the fire had never happened. The cafe was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, of a fresh start. And for the first time in years, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was part of something that mattered. The music played softly, the voices of the townspeople rising in joyful harmony. Caleb watched as Hannah laughed, her eyes shining with a hope that had been absent for so long. He hadn't just helped rebuild the cafe. He had helped rebuild her spirit. He could hear Lila's laughter in the background, and for the first time, Caleb didn't feel the weight of the past on his shoulders. He felt lighter, as if the road to redemption was no longer a distant dream, but something tangible. As he stood there, surrounded by the people who had become his family, Caleb realized that being a hero wasn't about saving the day. It was about showing up, being present, and choosing to do better each day. And in that moment, Caleb knew he had finally found his place. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the town of Flagstaff. The air felt fresher now, as if the storm had passed not only in the weather, but in the lives of the people who called this place home. Caleb stood outside the cafe, watching the bustling street in front of him. People smiled as they walked past, their voices filled with laughter and cheer. It was a far cry from the tense, uncertain atmosphere that had clouded the town just months ago. As he glanced over at Hannah, who was chatting with some of the townsfolk, Caleb felt a warmth spreading through him, one that had been absent for so long. He had come to Flagstaff to escape, to leave behind the mistakes of his past, but now it felt like he had found something he didn't even know he was searching for. A community, a chance to be part of something, a chance to finally make amends. Things had changed. They had to. The cafe was alive with activity now, much busier than it had been before the fire. People came in for coffee, pastries, and conversation. Some stayed for hours, chatting with neighbors, some even taking a moment to reflect. Caleb could hear snippets of conversations around him, and it struck him just how much this place, this community, had come to life again. He smiled to himself. He had played a role in that. He had helped Hannah rebuild not just the cafe, but the sense of trust and hope that had been lost. He hadn't known what he was capable of until he stepped into that role. He thought about the day when he had first helped Hannah after the fire, the way she had been lost, unsure of what to do next. That had been the turning point for him. He had wanted to run then, but now, looking at the cafe, the town, and the people who had embraced him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. "You look like you're thinking deep thoughts," Hannah said, breaking into his thoughts as she joined him outside. Caleb chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just trying to take it all in. It feels different now, doesn't it?" Hannah nodded, her eyes scanning the street. "It does. People are starting to believe again, not just in the cafe, but in each other, and in this town." The words hung between them, and Caleb could hear the gratitude in her voice. She had come so far, from the ashes of the fire to now standing tall again, surrounded by friends, by people who cared. And Caleb had been there, through it all, playing his part. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. "I'm glad you stayed," Hannah said quietly, her gaze shifting toward Caleb. "I'm glad you didn't run when things got hard." Caleb's heart twisted, but there was no pain anymore. No shame, just truth. "Me too," he said, looking her in the eye. "I've spent my whole life running, from myself, from my past, but here with you, with this, it feels like I'm finally starting to live again." Hannah smiled, a soft, knowing smile. You've always had it in you. Sometimes, you just need the right place to help you see it. Caleb's chest swelled at her words. He hadn't realized how much he had needed someone to believe in him. He had always been the one to doubt himself, to hide behind walls. But in Flagstaff, in this little cafe, he had found something he never thought he could, a chance for redemption. The sound of Lila's laughter reached them, and both turned to see her running toward them, her face glowing with happiness. She had been playing in the snow earlier, her cheeks rosy from the cold, but it was clear that she was thriving. She had become the heart of this new life they were building together. Uncle Caleb, look, I made a snowman bigger than last time, Lila beamed, tugging on Caleb's sleeve. Can we build another one tomorrow? Caleb laughed and bent down to her level. You bet we can. You're becoming a snowman expert. Lila's eyes sparkled as she hugged him tightly. He could feel her small arms around him, and in that moment, something inside Caleb softened. This was what it was all about. The chance to be part of something, to share in the joy of a life rebuilt. Hannah watched the exchange between them, her expression tender. You've come a long way, Caleb. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt fully seen. He wasn't the man he used to be, the one running from his mistakes. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't have all the answers, but he was here. He had made the choice to stay, to fight for something better, for something real. I couldn't have done it without you, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. You and Lila. He stopped, his throat tightening. You're both my family now. Hannah's eyes softened, and she stepped closer. We're all in this together. As they stood there, Caleb realized that Flagstaff wasn't just a town. It was the place where he had found his purpose, where he had faced the weight of his past and started to let it go. It was where he had found redemption, a new Flagstaff. And, for the first time in years, Caleb felt like he could finally breathe. The evening sky was clear, the stars scattered across the dark canvas like diamonds, shimmering in the cold winter air. The town square of Flagstaff had transformed into a haven of holiday cheer. A towering Christmas tree stood proudly at the center, its branches adorned with twinkling lights, and around it, people gathered in small clusters, laughing, singing, and sharing in the magic of the season. Caleb stood by the tree, his breath visible in the crisp night air, watching as the town celebrated. The warmth of the festivities contrasted sharply with the cold outside, but it wasn't just the decorations or the laughter that made this night special. It was the feeling in the air, a sense of togetherness that Caleb hadn't known was possible until now. His eyes moved to Hannah, who was standing nearby, talking with a few of the townsfolk. She was glowing, the weight of the past few months finally starting to lift from her shoulders. Her smile was genuine, her posture relaxed. The fire that had nearly consumed her had been extinguished by the love and support of the community. Beside her, Lila danced with a group of kids, her laughter ringing out above the rest. Caleb smiled, watching the joy in her face, the innocence of a child who hadn't yet learned the weight of the world. It was moments like this that made everything worth it. The late nights spent working on the cafe, the struggles, the uncertainty. Looks like they're having a good time, Hannah said, walking up beside Caleb, her voice warm with pride. They're not the only ones, Caleb replied, his gaze still fixed on Lila and the others. This is the kind of night I used to dream about. Hannah turned to him, her expression softening. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad we're here. Caleb's heart tightened at her words. For so long, he had carried the burden of his past, convinced that he didn't deserve anything good. He had thought that if he ran far enough, he could escape it all. But now, here he was, standing beside a woman who had shown him what it meant to rebuild, to heal, to let go of the pain and make space for hope. I never thought I could find peace again, Caleb said quietly, his voice low enough for only Hannah to hear. But tonight, I think I'm starting to understand what that feels like. Hannah's eyes met his, and for a moment there was only silence between them. The weight of their shared history, the struggles, the losses hung between them. But there was no longer a wall. There was only the shared understanding that they had both found something worth fighting for. We all have our pasts, Hannah said softly, but it doesn't have to define us. We get to decide what we make of it." Caleb nodded, feeling the truth of her words sink deep into his chest. He had spent so long defining himself by his mistakes, by the things he had lost. But here in this small town, he was starting to see that maybe the person he wanted to be had nothing to do with what he had left behind. It was about what he could build now, and what he had built here, with Hannah, with the people of Flagstaff, was something real, something worth holding on to. Lila ran up to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Uncle Caleb, come dance with us," she urged, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the group of children. Caleb hesitated, looking at Hannah. She smiled at him, the warmth in her expression making his heart swell. "Go on," she said softly. "You're a part of this now." He nodded and followed Lila, his feet light in the snow, the weight of his past finally lifting as he joined in the dance. The children giggled, spinning around in circles, and Caleb couldn't help but laugh along with them. For the first time in years, he felt completely at ease. His past no longer held power over him. Tonight, under the stars, he was simply a man surrounded by people who cared, who had welcomed him in, flaws and all. As the music played and the laughter continued, Caleb looked up at the sky, his heart full. The stars above shone brighter than ever, and he realized that this moment, was what he had been waiting for all along. Not redemption from the past, but a chance to build something new, something beautiful. He didn't need to be a hero. He didn't need to fix everything. He just needed to be present. And in that moment, Caleb knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Thank you," he whispered to the night sky, to the people around him, to himself. "For this, for them." The stars above twinkled as if in response, a reminder that no matter how dark the road had been, there was always light to be found.